Hello, you two.
Hi.
Hello.
All right, pleased to see me.
No, well,
You caught me by surprise a bit there.
I was pausing out of politeness so that Alex could go first.
Ladies first. So the other day there we started our new feature, which was getting people to email in where they'd seen politicians at gigs.
Oh, right.
And then that very night, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, played a gig in Kyiv. Almost like he'd been listening to Newscast on his armoured train from Poland.
But he might have been. Who's to say he wasn't?
Well, Paul was. He emailed us. He said, I was backstage at Live 8 when I got locked in the Portaloo Gents with Charles Kennedy. The main door got stuck. We listened to Coldplay sing Fix You as we pulled on the door with force and eventually freed ourselves.
That's quite the story. I mean, there's a whole other thing there, not just politicians at gigs, but locked in a loo with a politician. I don't know. Could that be a
side genre?
A side genre. Here's another one. This is from Alex on email. Good name. Last year, I was out in London at a Kylie Minogue-themed club night, Push the Button, and happened to see Labour MP Chris Bryant there. As if that wasn't starry enough, I also bumped into a certain Mr. Adam Fleming too.
Ooh. Yes, I
remember
that. I do remember that. And that was just after Chris Bryant had stood down from the Standards Committee who were investigating Boris Johnson about misleading Parliament. And I, after a couple of beers, was like haranguing him about what was going on with that. And I remember
a night out.
And I remember him
really
very clearly saying,
that.
yeah, he's like, Adam, even I don't want to discuss that here.
Did Alex Newscaster harangue
I
you
remember
about
bumping
Newscast
into
in the nicest
into
possible way?
Alex, yeah, and then maybe did we have a little boogie to like Can't Get You Out of My Head or something like that? Maybe.
Isn't Push the Button the Sugar Babes song?
Do you want to? Shall we go into the different club nights around various venues in London?
Well,
I think you'd be
I'm tempted to go.
Well, I'm just curious.
It is a Sugar Babe song, but
I have to say, really good knowledge, Chris, because I didn't even pick that up.
I didn't. Yeah,
I'm
you're
really
more
impressed.
of a Shania Twain man.
Well, tacky music. I like a bit of Kylie as well, but it's the conflict of Kylie and Push the Button.
It's a club night. I think it's once a month, and the idea is it's dedicated to one artist. And so they play like lots of other songs, but like every third or fourth song
so you get a
is
lot
song
of Kylie, but
by
not
that
exclusive
artist.
Kylie.
And the next one is actually Madonna.
Oh,
which
are
I'll
you going to go?
Definitely be going to that one.
You could get your ticket, Chris.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think we'll be troubling any of the music podcasters. Like, I don't think Nick Grimshaw and Annie Mac will be listening to this going, oh, I'm going to get replaced by them. So let's do what we can do, which is talk about the news on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
Hello, it's Alex in the studio.
It's Chris in the studio.
Why did neither of you two know when to speak?
He was being polite again, I think.
Okay, we're also joined by Steve Reid, who is the Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Hello.
Good to be with you.
Making your Newscast TV debut as well.
Yeah, I've not been on Newcast before. I'm very excited about it. Thank you for inviting me.
So we ask all the hard questions, like what's the next gig you're going to?
I'm going to see Kylie in Hyde Park in the summer. Would you believe it? Yes.
That'll be fantastic.
Are you a big Kylie fan, or is it just something you wanted to do?
I think she's just always sort of been there in the background as I've been growing up. So, she's sort of part of the soundtrack to my life one way or another. So it'd be great to see her.
I had a poster on my wall as a child, Kylie.
Yeah?
Yeah.
All I would say is those tickets were not cheap.
No, they were horrifically expensive. I bought them as a Christmas present, to be honest.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm not going to that because I couldn't afford it. But luckily, newscasters who are there will then be able to send in a sighting of you, and we can then
I'll send you a clip.
do this. Yeah, exactly. You just send me the good bits. Thanks. Right. You're here because it's been another big day for Labour, and I mean, I've said this a few times already this month. It's like, it really feels like the general election campaign's got started because Labour were doing what today?
They were starting their general election campaign.
Again.
That's what it kind of felt like. And I have tried to restrict my use of that sentence because I found myself kind of thinking I should use it when I was reporting on Rishi Sunak's speech that he did in Westminster on Monday. And then you had this thing with Labour today. So it was in Essex, in Purfleet, not a million miles from London. It was on a film set.
Really?
And the thing that I was struck by, there's two things we can talk about. And
Of
Steve,
what film?
Well, all sorts of bits and bobs
okay.
of filming
It's like
that
a
they do.
studio.
It's a swanky place. And the thing that I was most struck by around the event, and we can talk about the promises and all of that, of course, was the kind of razzmatazz of it. Can't have been cheap. I mean, it really can't have been cheap. There was videos and choreography and endorsements. Parties will always crave endorsements, whether it's from today, the Labour Party was endorsed by the boss of Boots, the high street chain. There was a guy who gave an incredibly powerful testimony about his experience with the NHS, who's dying from cancer. And the whole thing as an event was polished and slick. And now you might think, I mean, so what? Well, firstly, there's lots of events that aren't like that, or just quite small. Nothing wrong with that. But it just screamed, election is coming. Partly, for me, it was kind of a thought, I wonder if this would have been the general election launch for the party in this venue if the election had been in the summer. And maybe, you think, well, just do it anyway. And then underneath that are these ideas, this kind of pledge card that's not called a pledge card, or they're not calling it a pledge card, which is their bridge, they hope, between now and the election campaign to give them stuff to talk about that is understandable to voters. In the last 18 months or so, they've assembled various big picture themes, missions as they call them. This is the kind of how you translate that into stuff that you can try and persuade people with.
If it's not a pledge card, Steve, what are you calling it?
First steps. And the point of that is, the country's crying out for change. We saw that. I was up very late with Chris covering some of the local election results, but the country was voting for change. They're desperate for change. Keir's changed the Labour Party, so we're getting people that haven't felt able to vote for Labour for a long time coming across to vote for us now. And today was really about what Keir means by putting Labour at the service of working people, what a decade of national renewal needs to start with as we start that journey towards change. So these were the first steps towards the much bigger programme of change that we know the country needs.
Is it confusing that the 5 missions have now become 6 steps, some of which sound a bit like the 5 missions?
Well, they
and also these are first steps, which means there's probably more steps. So
well,
this is the first set of steps.
The missions were always extremely broad, and they were always intended to be focused down by the time we got to the general election. We're closer now, although we still don't know quite how close because we don't have, obviously, a date for it yet. So the 5 missions have become first steps towards each of those missions. But in the preamble to the missions, there was always the immigration element. So that's become a first step as well. I mean, these are really what we perceive voters to see as their priorities, where they want change, and what our first steps towards that bigger change might look like.
What was the process like in coming up with these? How did you whittle it down? Because what was picked up today is not just what's in here, but also what isn't. So, some stuff around housing, some direct stuff around climate, for example, which isn't in there. The New Deal for Working People, which you've talked about quite a lot of the party, which isn't in the 6. What was the process like? Did you have to go thrash through it in shadow cabinet?
It was done.
Did you have to bid for your area to be one of the 6?
It was done very much by the mission leads. So there's a group of colleagues who are.
They sound like something from Star Wars or something. The mission leads. Is that what they are?
But they would have had a lot of input in that. But it's these were intended to be pointers that show the direction that we will be moving in. So 6,500 new teachers being recruited isn't the sum of Labour's ambition to transform our education and open up opportunities for young people as it's described in the wider mission. But this is a first step towards it. And there's an important point in this as well, because at a time where there's 2 things lacking in British politics in particular right now, one is money and the other is trust, it's very important that we show how these first steps will be paid for. So each of them is that is made abundantly clear within them. But secondly, we have to be able to show that they are credibly deliverable, they're doable, so that people can see when we're saying what we're going to do, it will happen. Because trust in politics and in politicians, after what this government has done with 5 prime ministers, 7 chancellors since 2016. People have abandoned hope, and we've got to help rebuild that.
And on those specifics, there's the 2 specifics, isn't there? There's one about the extra 40,000 appointments in the NHS in England per week, and yet Keir Starmer couldn't put a time frame on when you would hit that number per week. And then on the teachers, to be clear, is that teachers additional to the numbers recruited for a first time in, say, the last year of the current government? What's the benchmark so that people can hold you to account if you get the chance to get into government?
It'll be additional teachers to the number that we have. Well, there's a big retention problem at the moment, so we know we have to do something about retention of the existing. Well, that's right. That's the effect of the retention problem, isn't it? But like I said, this isn't a delivery plan. These will be done within the first term, as early as it can be within the first term. But they are genuinely. It's called My First Steps. This is about the initial pointers, the signal policies that we will enact, pointing to that much bigger agenda. More of it will be flashed out in the manifesto when we know when the general election is going to happen.
When did you realise, as a party, that some of these plans don't apply to England or Wales and Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland because of devolution? Because there's a separate set of things now, isn't there?
Well, no, that was always known, and that was
Really?
always part
Okay.
of the plan. As far as I'm aware, when we talked about this in Shadow Cabinet, there was always going to be a Scottish and a Welsh version as well. I mean,
It's
Labour
just less
wants.
neat, though, isn't it? And also, this is an English list.
Well, it's not about
it's
neatness.
not very one nation, is it?
It's not about neatness. It's about reflecting the reality of devolution, and Labour believes in devolution. We want more power to be in the hands of people wherever they live in the United Kingdom and in different regions of England as well. We're really excited about the
Devolution isn't in the
mayors and
six,
how
though, is it?
No, but it's still part of Labour's agenda. These are first steps. It's very important. It's not a manifesto. There will be a full manifesto when we get much closer to the election. These are early
This is
steps.
what I mean. I don't know what to ask you about. Do I ask you about the 5 missions, which you said are deliberately vague and huge? Do I ask you about the 6 things which don't apply in every bit of the country? Or do I ask you about the actual delivery plans that you're going to come up with if you get elected, maybe?
Well,
Which one is it?
Well, I do hope we get elected, and I hope these help to show people that if they elect a Labour government, we will be practical, we'll be pragmatic, we'll make sure everything that we promise is costed so people will know that it can be delivered. We want to do politics differently. People don't like what they've seen under this Conservative government. Flip-flopping around, constant change, instability, a country that doesn't seem to work for working people anymore. These are the first steps towards that very, very big change this country needs.
Does it all feel quite presidential, this? I was struck at the event earlier that Keir Starmer, these first steps, as he calls them my first steps, as opposed to Labour's first steps. He was there today, unlike most of the other blokes in the room, wearing suit and tie and all the rest of it. I've also lost my tie, I suppose.
Not again.
He didn't have a jacket on, he didn't have a tie on, his sleeves were rolled up. Now, I know that sounds trivial, but senior politicians don't do that sort of thing by accident when they know they're going in the front
Well,
of the
unless
cameras.
he'd lost his tie as well.
Well, I asked
There's a lot of trains, a train going up and down somewhere between here and Essex with a lot of ties on
entire
it.
thing on the C2C rail line. What's all that about? What is he trying to communicate with the way that he looked today?
Well, I mean, Keir is the man who, if we win the election, will be Prime Minister. So it's absolutely right that Keir is central to the offer we're making. I mean, I've given my pledge cards away already. I did take a few with me, but they've got a very good picture of Keir on the front, looking very workmanlike. That is what he's like. I think there's an authenticity in how he came across today. I know I've known the guy for a long time. That is how he comes across. You know, when you're speaking to him. And I thought. He felt to me, in the way that he was delivering that speech as well, it felt much more engaging than I've seen him speaking sometimes. I don't know whether that's because he's becoming more accustomed to it,
I've got a
to
little
public
thing on this.
speaking.
I noticed, actually. So I was sitting there, and there were loads of speakers today at this event, politicians
quite long.
and others. All of whom, except Keir Starmer, were reading pretty much word for word off an auto cue. And when Keir Starmer did his thing, I just looked because the auto cue was over my shoulder. It had bullet points. So the core points were all there, but then he sort of chatted around them and therefore didn't have to stare at the kind of auto cue the whole time. And I've seen him do stuff off the cuff before, but it was the first time I'd seen him do that kind of hybrid
Well,
thing.
when we're doing speeches as politicians or presenters, I'm sure as well, you need bullet points to make sure you're not forgetting what you're saying. But I think the way Keir talked about it, there was something very authentic to him about that, and I think that was reflected in how he looked as well. But it's also in what we're talking about. You know, the missions is his idea for how you can refocus government over a much longer term, get away from this flip-flopping around we've had from the Conservatives, and have some constancy and consistency in government. And then these first steps, again, reflect the missions. So there is a real agenda here. It's very authentic to Keir. And I thought today's event, for all that you described, you know, the relative glitz of it, it was very Keir as well, wasn't it?
Relative.
It is politics.
It's not highly.
It's not kind.
You're very careful not to call them pledges, but inevitably there's been a whole load of comparison to 1997 and Tony Blair's famous first pledge card with his 5 pledges on it. I wasn't actually at the event today, but as well as the speeches, and then there was a Q&A after, right, Chris, with the media, and then you guys all did sit downs with Keir Starmer, and I watched all of that, and there was so much focus on whether or not this is Tony Blair Mark II. Is Keir Starmer the heir to Blair? You know, are we seeing the reinvention of Blair? What do you think when you hear that? Is that a comparison you welcome or worry about?
well, it was nearly 30 years ago, was it? The better part of 30 years ago since Tony Blair
But I mean,
won
distance
his
itself
first
doesn't mean that
victory.
he's not trying to do something similar.
We're not trying to go backwards. This was about looking at the problems the country faces today and how you project that forwards. I mean, there's one thing I'd love to learn from Tony Blair. He won 3 elections in a row. We lost the last 4. We need to win more than one in order to deliver that decade of national renewal. It's very hard to think of any public services today that perform better than they did in 2010 when the Conservatives were first elected. So the transformation has got to be immense. But you've got to show people how that can be achieved. At a time when people have lost faith in politics and politicians, you've got to show them how that long journey can start with steps that they can understand, that they can see are credible and that can be delivered and can be paid for. And that's what today was all about, doing politics differently.
Help me out with the sort of psychology of this. You've been a proud Labour member for many, many years, and you were talking about Labour's recent record, which is 4 consecutive defeats. And historically, if you look back over the last century, the Conservatives are considerably more successful when it comes to winning elections than Labour. How do you kind of wrestle with that loyalty you have to the party through thick and thin, with trying to get into a place where there's that kind of, and I saw it there at that event today, perhaps a sort of drive, a determination that maybe hasn't always been there in the past to win with a certain ruthlessness?
Well, it's Keir's leadership that has transformed the Labour Party from the party that the voters rejected so comprehensively in 2019. It's almost bizarre now to think what a short period of time it has been during which this transformation has happened. When Keir was elected leader, which was it was April of 2020, wasn't it? Very few people, me included, would have believed that we could be in this position now. And in order to get us into this position, where we are potentially able to win the trust of the British public, Keir had to change the Labour Party from top to bottom. But that's what he's done. And by changing the Labour Party, putting it back in the service of working people, he's demonstrating he has the ability to change this country, and people want change.
Interesting, though. So when Keir Starmer was elected as Labour's leader, were you sort of crossing your fingers and hoping for the best? Because the implication of what you've said is that there's a parallel universe where Keir Starmer wasn't able to do this.
No,
You weren't completely convinced.
I backed Keir, right, from before he put himself forwards, actually. We had conversations. I was one of those people encouraging Keir to stand, because he has authority, has credibility. As a former director of public prosecutions, he led and transformed a major government department. He was able to do that.
Do you wake up sweating in the night, given all of those previous losses, and think, it could still all go pear-shaped?
Yes, absolutely. You see all of these polls and you see how much better we did in the local elections, but not a single vote has been cast for the general election yet. And when you just said the Conservatives are the most successful electoral machine in any democratic country in the world. There are formidable opponents. Labour, the state we were in when Keir became leader, was the worst we'd been, our worst defeat for 85 years. So I think it's right we should be afraid that we won't do enough to win people's trust, because we have to fight really hard for every single vote, and we win. But, we've lost the last 4. We're shockingly good at losing elections. But what that means is we're then unable to put ourselves at the service of this country. And that's what we want to do. We want to improve life and futures for people right across this country, because as we saw in the local election results, all of those conversations I had on doorsteps right across the country, people are desperate for change.
We talked about Tony Blair. Would you welcome Gordon Brown back with an official job?
I think
moment.
Going forwards, you don't bring back figures from the past in quite that way. They have a lot of experience, and I think it's quite right to respect that and to listen to what they have to say. But we have a different crop of politicians today. We have a leader I have immense trust in, and we're shaping an agenda that I hope will meet the aspirations that the British people have for their families, their communities, and their country moving forwards, because trust in politics and in the future is such a low ebb right now.
That was a very polite no thanks, Gordon.
It was.
Yeah.
Oh, I love Gordon. I've spoken to Gordon as well.
His face.
Who'd you give all your pledge cards to?
Sorry?
If you've run out, who'd you give all your pledge
Well,
cards to?
I've been doing the media round, so I've given to lots of journalists, I'm afraid.
Well, and last question on the pledge is, because it's 2024 and not 1997, you can download a QR code. You scan a QR code, and it now turns up in your Apple Wallet next to your loyalty cards.
Yeah.
So mine's in there in between my boot Boots Advantage card and my Burrito loyalty card. Have you downloaded it to your phone?
I haven't, I'm afraid. I'm a slight Luddite in that respect. You can't brandish the card in an interview, can you, when it's on your phone?
Or get any points in shops?
No, yeah. Or is there points? Is there like a points scheme?
I think it's great. I mean, it's necessary that it should be digital because we're looking at digital transformation in the economy. It's one of the things we'll be looking for.
And to be clear, I downloaded it for journalistic purposes. I might delete it actually because it is a bit weird having it there.
Well, I don't know. When you get us to when you're doing a bit of broadcasting,
Yeah,
and have to roll out the
aid
pledges.
memoir.
Aid
Oh,
memoir.
and last question. Do you get is there like a dress code for male members of the Shadow Cabinet?
No.
You were all wearing blue suits and burgundy
it's
ties.
really sad, Adam.
Just by accident.
We did this to ourselves. So we were saying as it finished we're all wearing like slightly purple red
I didn't
ties.
notice
And a
that. Were you all
blue,
wearing the same
blue
thing?
suit.
Pretty much, yeah.
Pretty much.
What colour
Very
tie did you
slight
have on
the
earlier?
variations in
I
pattern.
can't remember. I was too busy obsessing about Keir Starmer's rolled-up sleeves to notice that all the rest of you were dressed the same.
No, I've got to get myself some new clothes.
Oh, come on,
Clearly.
that can't happen by coincidence. You were
Oh,
wearing
it did
the same
happen by
stuff.
coincidence, yeah.
Are you
I
gonna now-
dress myself in the
And
morning.
also, Shadow Defra, have you got a good pair of wellies?
I've got a good pair of wellies,
Okay.
actually, yeah, and they've been getting some good use because I went on a sewage tour in the run-up to the local election, so you wouldn't do that without a decent pair of wellies on your feet.
I mean, there's plenty of it. Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thoughts, you two?
I think it's fascinating because obviously there's this. I don't know if you call it a dilemma, but it's certainly a really big consideration in Labour's mind at the moment, which is how do you try and spell out with some clarity to the voters what you want to do when you get into government without promising them too much that you can't deliver it. And I think what we're seeing play out right now with Labour is this kind of very cautious, careful approach to trying to put some flesh on the bones of what they're all about without holding themselves hostage to fortune. So they do leave people feeling disappointed or disillusioned. And I think there's a consciousness in the party. There's a real risk to that. I think the danger for them is that what they end up doing is still not saying quite enough or being clear enough or really just coming up with an offer that people can really wrap their heads around. And I think they're in that really quite tricky point right now.
I remember someone in Labour saying to me a while ago, and I may have used this line before on Newscast, that where they see themselves is that they can't afford a moon on a stick, and even if they could, no one would believe them. So there's the economic backdrop, and then there's the kind of, scepticism, cynicism, anti-politics backdrop. And then there's the thing, where it's very easy and it's our job to ask really searching questions, and when are you going to deliver that promise by, and is there an end date, and what about this number, and all the rest of it. But then there's the dilemma that Alex talks about that the parties face around over-promising. But then if you under-promise, what do you stand for, and what have you got to go out and say? But you don't want to shackle yourself to something that becomes undeliverable. But at the same time, you've got to say something and give some sort of measure or metric of what would amount to, as you see it, success. Because otherwise you're going to get hammered for being vague and not really standing for anything. And that is, that's hard.
I just thought, and I don't know how useful this point is, but it definitely did strike me today. So you've got unveiling a pledge card.
Not a pledge card.
Not a pledge card, but like a list of pledges that are
On a card.
that are
On a card,
on
yeah.
a medium. People coming into personal testimony to introduce each policy area. A leader who goes quite heavy on anecdotes of people he's met, doesn't really have a script and doesn't stand at a podium and like walks around the stage sort of ad-libbing. Ed Miliband did this in 2015. And also has slightly tortuous language sometimes, like, oh, stability is change and radical but with responsibility. And it just took me right back to that event that I went to with Ed Miliband in 2015.
And it's also not just Ed Miliband in 2015, but actually we talked about Tony Blair, but it wasn't just Tony Blair in 1997. That then became the model for successive
Well,
kind
that's
of
what pledge
wannabe
cards
Labour.
are, yeah.
It is. I mean, it's gone through, and I genuinely don't know this, but I wonder, is that what people will remember? I mean, I don't know. If of course Labour are now going to talk about this a lot because that's how it all works for all parties, is they decide on their messages and they repeat them and they repeat them and they repeat them. But I don't know at what point, and this is true of any party, people on the doorstep would be able to tell them back. Do you know what I mean? So I know what it is that you stand for. Who knows? Is these sort of 6 steps, pledges, newly developed missions going to do that?
No, we are not the only TV programme where 4 smart people sit in an awkward line in a studio. Loose Women on ITV.
Oh, I wonder where you're going with that.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think they do
the
two images. Like it looks like a similar format. Rishi Sunak was on there today, and actually it was an interesting interview because he was clearly on there to pitch all the stuff that the government today done about sex education in schools in England, and so obviously thought that's a good audience to pitch that stuff at. They asked him some tough questions, obviously, because they're all like good journalists. But the toughest one came from Janet Street Porter, who had this singer.
I think your heart's in the right place, but why do you hate pensioners?
So what we did over winter, because you've been asking what we're helping with energy bills over winter. So for everyone, all pensioners received double their winter fuel payment. They didn't have to apply for it.
Yeah.
They were just given it. Right, and that's double, so up to £300 extra over the winter to help with energy bills. The state pension's gone up by £900, far greater than inflation and prices are rising. Thankfully, we've got inflation down now. So I think that will really help.
And yeah, Janet Street Porter went on at some length about why she thought the Conservatives hated pensioners. So we chopped that bit out for timing reasons. That's why there was a little edit in there. But I suppose two things there, Chris. There's just the thing about actually the Conservative Party's relationship with older voters, with pensioners. And second of all, back to that cliched point I made at the start, this is politicians popping up in places they wouldn't normally pop up in.
Totally. So on the pensioners' point, the demographics point, if you like, broadly speaking, recent history has suggested that the Conservatives do disproportionately well amongst older people, amongst pensioners. So it's a really important kind of chunk of the population to court, not least because they vote in disproportionately high numbers. On the Loose Women thing, so a bunch of us political reporters who were due to do interviews with Keir Starmer were outside the room where they were going on. They always kick out all of the other reporters whilst each reporter goes in and does their thing. And we were all hunched around a laptop watching Rishi Sunak on Loose Women. And then I went in to talk to Keir Starmer and I just said, I've just been watching Rishi Sunak on Loose Women. And just whilst we were putting the microphones on and all the rest of it. And he was reflecting that I think he's been on before, that it's flipping hard. It's really hard, isn't it? Because it's one thing dealing with us lot as political reporters and a fairly usually predictable set of topics. But there you are around the table. You don't quite know which way to look. There's a studio audience that might be laughing or applauding or booing or goodness knows what. I mean, you combine the film set in Essex and Rishi Sunak on Loose Women, and that just kind of screams, doesn't it, election, even though we could still be pre-polling day on Halloween or on bonfire night. It's a long way off.
It's quite a long way off. Yeah, I mean, the other thing about those things is that they're often the ones where politicians find themselves really caught out because they get asked that question they just don't expect. So the whole Theresa May, what was the naughtiest thing you ever did? Or what's the price of milk in a shop? It's those things that they're completely unprepared for that are the moments that are risky for politicians when they go on programmes like that. And actually talking about constituencies of voters that they're trying to call, I mean, that is what we're going to see. I mean, like already, there's so many examples of it, but one that I was doing a lot of work on last week, in fact, was the farming community. You've had people at the NFU conference. Keir Starmer wrote for Country Life magazine. Just, I don't know, gird your loins or whatever the phrase is, because it's going to be, is that a phrase? It's going to be a hell of a lot more than this.
Gird your loins for Loose Women.
No, but for politicians popping up in unexpected places, although I think that's probably just made the saying I said worse.
The other thing about Loose Women, I was going to say two things, is Rishi Sunak had to confess at the start that he doesn't watch Loose Women because it's on in the middle of the day and he's usually, but they were fine about that. Second of all, right at the end, they said, will you stay on as an MP even if you aren't Prime Minister anymore? And he said, yeah, absolutely, yes. But I suppose you've got to say that, haven't you? What's your next gig, by the way, Chris?
My next gig is re-editing a piece for the 10 o'clock news.
Whoa, for sure biz.
You know how to live. I'm going to see the Foo Fighters in June.
Ooh, whereabouts?
My favourite band. At the old Olympic Stadium, now the London Stadium in London. I know, it was a real one of those ones really hard to get tickets. Yeah.
So I've got a favourite Foo Fighters song.
Oh.
And when they were... Because did they do Glastonbury? Was it last year or the year before?
I haven't seen them at Glastonbury.
Oh, right. They were doing some sort of
You've
thing.
made a cultural reference that I don't know.
So they were doing a gig that my wife and I were watching on the telly. And she knows that there's this particular Foo Fighters song that I really love. And then, is it Dave Grohl?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. He says, right, we're going to play a song that I know some people like, but I think he said, we really, really don't like.
Was it your song?
Yeah. Wheels.
Wow. There you go.
Do you like Wheels?
No.
Well, on that note, we'll be back with another episode of Newscast very soon. Thank you for listening to this one. Bye.
Newscast from the BBC.